All right. Hello, YouTube. Um, just want to make a little discussion here about the top 10 quarterbacks of all time. I was looking around and I noticed that there really isn't a lot, there really aren't, I guess I should say, a lot of videos out there on this, or at least as not as many as I thought there would be. I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to jump in and just really have a more longer drawn out discussion on this because I feel like a lot of videos that do exist on this are very fast paced and they're throwing just a lot of stats at you at once and a lot of information, and they're usually just a few minutes, or maybe really just a lot of information in a condensed period of time. So I thought this would be a nice chance for us to just have a nice long drawn out conversation on this. I'm going to give you guys my top 10 quarterbacks of all time. And we'll go from 10 to 1, I guess. I thought about going from 1 to 10 because most people probably know who's number 1, but where's the fun in that? We'll go 10 to 1. Um, and it'll just be casual. There's not going to be any graphics or anything. Maybe if I keep on making videos after this, I'll put some. We could have different kinds of videos where it's screen recordings or other formats once I become more familiar with it. But for now, this will just be me rambling. I do have uh, a bunch of Pro Football Reference pages up on my computer here, so that'll be primarily what I'm using. And of course, obviously, watching the NFL my entire life. So um, this will also be good for any younger viewers out there who haven't seen some of these guys or maybe aren't as familiar with them. So before we jump right into it, we could have maybe just a couple honorable mentions. Obviously, there's a ton that are worth mentioning from all different eras. You could go all the way back, of course, like pre-merger, like Otto Graham days with the Cleveland Browns. I know the Cleveland fans will probably be upset if I didn't at least mention him, but um, all the way from then up until modern times, because of course there's a ton of amazing quarterbacks that played in the 2000s and 2010s. But if I had to just pick a couple, I would probably go with the two that was very close to putting on the list were Jim Kelly and Warren Moon. These guys both played in the 80s into the 90s. Warren Moon, of course, primarily with the Houston Oilers, no longer around. Later bounced around to a few different teams, Minnesota, Seattle, and eventually ended up with the Chiefs, although he barely even played with them. Um, of course, both Warren Moon and Jim Kelly, two of the best quarterbacks to never have won a Super Bowl. On the top 10 list, like the actual top 10 list, there's, I believe, only one quarterback that hasn't won a Super Bowl. So, um, and most people probably could guess who that is. But yeah, I'd say Warren Moon and Jim Kelly were very close to making the list. Jim Kelly, uh, Buffalo Bills, 1986 to 1996, only played with them. He did make the Super Bowl 4 straight years, 1990 through 1993. Uh, Very impressive stats for the time. He had career year in 1991, 33 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. That honestly holds up as a pretty solid quarterback season even today, so it's pretty incredible he was able to do that over 30 years ago. Um, at Buffalo, just steamrolling the AFC in the early 90s. Andre Reed and all the talent they had on that offense. Um, Absolutely incredible. But both of these guys probably got overshadowed by some of the other quarterbacks that'll get mentioned later on this list. Um, just thought that they'd be worth throwing out there. Um, and who else? Oh, and I was very tempted to put Patrick Mahomes at number 10 on the list, but I feel like it's just too soon with him. I think most people would agree on that at this point. Um, And he was really my motivation for making this list because he's had such an amazing start to his career. Only 5 years as a starter, but already just absolutely bonkers statistically. Already has two Super Bowl rings with two Super Bowl MVPs, two league MVPs, two first team All Pros, a second team All Pro, a Pro Bowl all of his years in the league. Although the Pro Bowl really isn't something that I would say is a great benchmark for success for quarterbacks with uh, Tyler Huntley making the Pro Bowl last year with the Ravens, just because so many guys don't even opt to go to it anymore, that the league just ends up going down the list so many times. Like you go from okay, the A tier quarterbacks don't want to play in the Pro Bowl, so we'll pull some B tier guys, and then well, those guys now don't even want to go either, so they just end up going so far down the list. No disrespect, of course, to Tyler Huntley, but I think any NFL fan would agree he's not he's not a Pro Bowl caliber quarterback. He's not one of the best quarterbacks you think of when we talk about the NFL. But anyway, that's a whole nother tangent. Um, but yeah, Patrick Mahomes on an incredible trajectory for his career and the playoff. And really, the thing that stands out to me with him too, and I'll be bringing this up with some of these other quarterbacks, is the playoff stats. He really just has, I mean, obviously team success in the playoffs, but he just performs very efficiently in the playoffs as well. Um, he already has 35 career passing touchdowns in the playoffs and only 7 interceptions with over 4,000 yards, which I believe is in the top 10. Um, so obviously only 5 years in the league as a starter, so I can't in good faith put him in the top 10 right now, but my God, he has another great season or two. Even if he falls off the face of the earth after that, he's I mean, even now he's probably already a first ballot Hall of Famer, and I think he's only going to get better. But we'll see because I put a list together like this just for myself a couple of years ago, and one of the people I had in my honorable mentions was Russell Wilson. But obviously now, like I think it's pretty after the season he had with Denver last year, Russell Wilson probably isn't in that discussion at the moment. We'll see when his career is all said and done, but Patrick Mahomes is certainly on that trajectory. So, honorable mentions aside, let's get into the meat of this. Let's get into the top 10 itself. And we'll start off with a guy who I originally wasn't going to put on this list. And I know most people probably even have him higher on their own lists, probably consider him to be closer to a top five quarterback, but I'll say John Elway is my number 10, which when I made this list a couple of years back, I didn't even have him on it because his statistics weren't overly impressive to me, especially compared to some of the other quarterbacks of that era. Like the guys I just mentioned, Jim Kelly and Warren Moon, I think like in terms of individual statistics, their stat lines are superior. For um, as many as much as people praise John Elway, I don't think his stats really back that up super well. But I mean, you go down the list, he has one league MVP in the shortened season, 1987. Only 12 games played. I believe that was due to the player strike. And he has, let's see, one, two, three second team All Pros, no first team All Pros. And of course, he won two Super Bowls with Denver, took them to 5 appearances, which you can't discount that. He played with some pretty garbage Denver teams. Um, Granted, I wasn't alive in the 1980s to see that, but I did grow up watching a ton of NFL films, NFL Network as a kid. Um, so I have seen what John Elway had to go up against in some of those Super Bowls. Like, he was really just outmatched in a lot of those games, so I can't really hold that against him too much. And then once he did get the team around him in his twilight years in the late 90s, he did eventually get over the hump in 1997. All-time classic Super Bowl between the Broncos and Packers. I feel like that one really doesn't get talked about as much in terms of all-time great Super Bowls. I mean, that could be another video too, but um, Yeah, I mean, once John Elway had the team around him, he had the coaching. Obviously, Terrell Davis in his prime, all-time great Hall of Famers on the defense. Um, yeah, he was able to win that Super Bowl in 1997. This one was for John, as they would say when he got the trophy. But even more impressive, he comes back the following year. He could have easily just walked off into the sunset then after 15 years in the league with his Lombardi, because that's what he wanted. But he knew the team was put together. He knew that they were right there still. He comes back the next year in 1998, and he misses a few games with injury. Infamously, Bubby Brister took over for the Broncos that year, wrote the ship for a few games, and was able to keep them on course. They had an even better regular season that year. They went 10-2 with Elway. I believe they finished 14-2 for that season with the first seed, and then I mean they obviously steamrolled in the playoffs that year. Not really as much of a competition in the Super Bowl against Atlanta. Should have been Minnesota that year, but not as much of a competition with Atlanta. But Elway was able to go out with a back-to-back. He was able to go out with two Super Bowl rings, and of course, there's so many great players in the NFL who were able to Hall of Fame players who were able to go out on top, were able to win in their last game. I think in the 21st century, just some that come off the top of my head, you have Jerome Bettis, Michael Strahan, Ray Lewis, Peyton Manning. I'm sure there's many more I can't even think of right now, but the fact that Elway was able to do that and then he came back the next year and won it again always amazed me, even as a kid. Because, like, man, what if they didn't win it and he went out? He didn't go out with the Super Bowl. Of course, no one could ever take away Super Bowl 32 that they won the year before, but man, to win the back to back at the end is really that's his lasting legacy. I think for a lot of people, when most people think of him, it's those two Super Bowl wins, and I just think of him as a winner. And you look at like his playoff stats, and they're not bad by any means. Well, where'd it go? Let me pull it up again. So for John Elway in the regular season, he had a career touchdown percentage of 4.1 to an interception percentage of 3.1 over 16 seasons, which, I mean, for the 80s into the 90s, especially considering with some of those teams he played, like, that's not bad. Like, his stats aren't as bad as I remember. He did have some rough seasons in there, like 1992. This was another injury shortened season, but 12 games started, 12 games played, only 2,200 yards or just over with 10 touchdowns and 17 interceptions. Like, for a guy who's a top 10 quarterback of all time in his age 32 season, like, that's pretty rough, I'm not going to lie. And some of these other seasons in here too, like 1988, like, this is John Elway at age 28. He has 3,300 passing yards with 17 touchdowns to 19 interceptions. Like, that's kind of rough if you ask me. Um, Although they did go to the Super Bowl that year, I believe, and lose to the 49ers. Um, but I mean, you look at his playoff stats, and there's really nothing egregious here, though, which is what really surprised me when looking at his playoff stats. Because I remember when I did this list before, I didn't really consider Elway because of those rough regular seasons during his prime. But even during those same years in the playoffs, like, his stats aren't bad by any means. So his career stats in the playoffs, he has just shy of 5,000 yards for his career, and his touchdown percentage is exactly the same, 4.1%, while his interception percentage is just a hair above where it was for the regular season, 3.2. But man, you're going up against a lot tougher teams in the playoffs, much higher level of competition. Defenses know that season's on the line. Um, So yeah, the fact that he was able to maintain his regular season stats in that regard is very impressive. And if even if you just go down the individual seasons here, there's really no season that I would say is like terrible by any means. Like 1986, 3 touchdowns to 4 interceptions in 3 games started. 1987, 6 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Like there's really, it's pretty even for the most part. Um, and he was able to like, I mean, you look at the games played, like 1986, 3 games started, 1987, 3 games started, 1989, 3 games started, 1991, 2 games started. When you look at playoff stats, like games played is a huge factor in that, because even if a guy isn't winning rings, I know everybody wants to talk about the rings now, especially with Brady having 7, but I mean, for me, rings aren't the end all be all. But man, you look at like a quarterback like Elway consistently getting his team deep in the postseason, especially when his teams were largely carried by him. Like that's definitely very impressive to me. Um, so I'll have him come in at number 10. I feel some people probably would have him higher than that, but for me, the top 9 were actually really easy to figure out. The order of them, a little more subjective, of course, but the debate for me was more so Elway versus the honorable mentions I said before. So like Warren Moon, Jim Kelly. I think Mahomes honestly could have this spot in the next year or two if he continues his success. But I mean, John Elway's a Hall of Fame quarterback, one of the greatest of all time. I don't think anybody's going to debate that. But for now, he's number 10. I wouldn't really have him much higher just because some of these other names on here are just so iconic. They're just done so much for the league. Just like great combination of individual achievements, individual statistics, and team success. And the leadership aspect definitely plays a huge part in that too. Um, Not that I think Elway's a bad leader by any means. He's a top 10 quarterback of all time, but I think as we start getting along on this list, you'll see like the fact that some of these guys can really rally to make the team around them better is really something that doesn't get mentioned enough with great quarterbacks. Because, yeah, they're only one guy out of 11 on the field at a time and really one guy out of 53. It's not like LeBron James on the basketball court where he's just one of 5 guys playing both ways for 48 minutes some at times, as crazy as that is. But, um, yeah, a quarterback who's able to make his teammates better is definitely not to be sold short. And I think that's one of Patrick Mahomes' defining attributes too, and what's really going to propel him into this list further. And of course, just natural talent, like that has to be mentioned too. And Elway's a very naturally gifted player, and that's another reason why he should absolutely be in consideration for a spot like this. Um, so we'll move on here to number 9. Keep this moving. At number 9, we'll go more modern. This is a player I grew up watching. A player that a lot of people are most probably very familiar with. He just retired a couple of years ago, and that's Drew Brees. So Drew Brees is a very fascinating career because he starts out with the San Diego Chargers in 2001, fresh off the Ryan Leaf era, and they had a fantastic draft that year. They got LaDainian Tomlinson in round 1 and Drew Brees in round 2, and like you look back from a historic perspective, and you have that kind of draft. That's a really solid 1-2 punch. Those are 2 Hall of Fame players you grabbed in the same draft. So that sets them up for, you would think, just offensive dominance in the 2000s. But of course, it doesn't really pan out that way with Drew Brees and the Saints. He doesn't really start his first year, and then kind of has to outbattle Doug Flutie, old man Doug Flutie at the time, for his job in 2002. He comes in. I mean, he does decent. Um, they go 8-8 that year. He has 3,200 passing yards, 17 touchdowns, 16 interceptions, but he really doesn't catch fire until 2004 when the Chargers draft Phillip Rivers, and that was kind of a wake-up call for him to say, like, okay, I need to step up. Because he felt that was his job, and he definitely, I'm sure, felt slighted that the Chargers were so quick to just look in another direction in 2004. And I don't blame the Chargers because 2004 was a loaded quarterback class. Infamously, they had the number 1 overall pick, wanted to get Eli Manning, but Archie had other ideas. So Phillip Rivers ends up with the Chargers. Spoiler alert, he's not on this list, but I am a huge fan of Phillip Rivers and what he was able to achieve in his career. Another one of those quarterbacks who, like, he's probably like the modern day Warren Moon, Jim Kelly kind of quarterback. Just amazing, but definitely the fact that he didn't win a Super Bowl, he didn't win any MVPs, it's probably going to hold him back from being mentioned as an all-time great, and definitely overshadowed by other players of his era, much like Jim Kelly and Warren Moon. Um, but anyway, back to Drew Brees. So Drew Brees still with the Chargers for 2 years after Rivers gets there. Has a really nice season in 2004. They go 11-4, 27 touchdowns, only 7 picks. They end up making the playoffs, but he ends up battling some health issues. He didn't play bad in 2004. Lost one game, goes 319 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Should really know this, but I'm just going to check who they played real quick. Oh, it was to the Jets, that's right. And then the Jets going to lose to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh lose to the Patriots, and Patriots beat the Eagles. But anyway, so then after that, Drew Brees sticks around for one more year in San Diego before they're like, all right, that's it. We're moving on with Rivers. He's our guy, which is a shame because in hindsight, like, imagine if the Chargers were just stuck with Brees and they took like Larry Fitz in '04. They could have really had a nice offense with Tomlinson, Fitzgerald, Antonio Gates, eventually Vincent Jackson. I mean, their offense was loaded in the late 2000s anyways, but they could have even been on another level. But what most people remember Drew Brees for is definitely his tenure with the Saints. Signs there in 2006 after almost signing with Miami and Nick Saban when he was dipping his toe in the NFL water with the Dolphins, but I think he likes to forget about that. So Sean Payton signs Drew. Well, Sean Payton as news coach of the Saints brings in Drew Brees. 2006, big recruiting job for him. And I mean, from there, like Drew Brees' career just absolutely explodes. He has 4,000 yards a season for the next decade plus. The next season, he doesn't cross 4,000 yards after he joins the Saints. It wasn't until 2017, which is absolutely mind-numbing to think about. He tops 5,000 yards 5 times. 5 times he tops 5,000 yards, which is like, he just made it normal. Like, that was just like, yeah, no big deal for him. Tops 5,000 yards 5 times, throws for 30 touchdowns, 11 times with the Saints, throws for 40 touchdowns, another 2. He was just an absolute statistical machine, and he only threw 20 or more interceptions once. One time in his career, and that was in 2010. Um, but of course, the year before that, he won his first and only Super Bowl with the Super Bowl MVP. So even though that 2010 season was a little bit of a letdown, I don't think that fazed him. He came back with probably his best work in 2011. I would really say that was his magnum opus. But even the thing with Drew Brees, too, much like some of these other quarterbacks that we've mentioned so far, just overshadowed by some other guys of his era. 2011, even though he threw for almost 5,500 yards with 46 touchdowns and only 14 interceptions, didn't even win the MVP. That went to Aaron Rodgers because the Packers went 15-1 that year, which is kind of a trend for Drew Brees' career. He has these great statistical seasons, but there's usually a team in the NFC that does better than the Saints. There's usually a quarterback who has a better season than him. So he doesn't really get the individual accolades. He never wins a league MVP. He's consistently in the conversation. He gets, let's see here, he gets 1, 2, 3 second team All Pros, 0 first team All Pros, which is crazy to think about for as great of a career as he had. But I think the thing with him, though, like, it's the playoffs, right? Like, he's not. I don't think he had. It's weird because I don't think Drew Brees has a reputation for being a playoff choker by any means. There's definitely definitely one quarterback on this list later that we'll talk about who I would say does have that reputation. But Drew Brees, let's see. So he comes in. He only has 18 career playoff games started, which I mean, I say only. That's a lot still, but compared to some of these other guys, that's not a ton. Only one Super Bowl appearance, of course, in Super Bowl 44, which that is definitely his career-defining game. That's his career-defining moment. When people look back on Drew Brees, like, and that era of the Saints with Sean Payton, that's the year that's going to get talked about the most. I mean, that playoffs, he was pretty much perfect. He goes for only 3 games started because the Saints went 13-3 that year. They had the first round bye, but 732 yards in 3 games with 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. Absolutely incredible. Well-deserved Super Bowl MVP in his age 30 season. But the problem, though, is he. So before that, he makes the playoffs his first year with the Saints, and they get to the conference championship where they lose to Rex Grossman and the Bears. I mean, I know Rex Grossman wasn't the heartbeat of that team, it was the defense, but still, the fact that you lost to a far inferior quarterback, one that I don't think anybody's talking about as an all-time great, not even really an all-time good quarterback, um, really shows. And I mean, let have to respect that 2006 Bears defense. They were lethal, and they held the Colts in check in Super Bowl 41, so I'm not going to discount them by any means. And it was his first year with the Saints, so that was fine. And he had 2 games started, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. The game they won was against, again, Eagles. But after that, though, between that season and their Super Bowl season, they missed the playoffs both of those years in 2007 and 2008. One of those years was in 2008. Drew Brees throws for 5,000 yards, 34 touchdowns, and the Saints missed the playoffs with an 8-8 record. If I recall correctly, I believe they were last place in the NFC South that year, which, man, I mean, I'm not going to hold that against Drew Brees, I guess. It's just kind of bad luck, but really what ends up holding him back in the long run, because then they have the 2 follow-up seasons to the 2009 Super Bowl, 2010 and 2011. 2010, of course, the Beastquake game against the lowly 7-9 Seahawks. He doesn't play bad in that game. He throws for 404 yards and 2 touchdowns. So like definitely another solid statistical game, but they get bounced early, and that seems to be a trend for the Saints during this era. And I think that's ultimately what holds him back in this conversation. Not that I think Drew Brees is good as, like, I don't think Drew Brees is in like the GOAT conversation for quarterback, but man, if he's able to get like just a couple more deep playoff runs in here and maybe another Super Bowl appearance or two, um, again, because I don't think the rings are the end all be all, but it's just the fact that there's so many seasons here where the Saints either get bounced early in the playoffs by a team that's not as good as them, or more often than that, they just outright miss the playoffs. And again, it's not Drew Brees' fault, um, but that definitely has to be considered. Because then 2011, they lose to the 49ers in the divisional round. This was the year it was supposed to be Packers versus Saints, which was a matchup that we were expecting, that we thought was going to be the new Patriots Colts. But funny enough, those two teams never even played each other in the playoffs in the 2010s. So then 2013, Saints beat, again, Eagles, then lose in the second round to Seattle, I believe. Doesn't have a great playoff that year. Not bad by any means, but not great. Then they missed the next 3 seasons, 14, 15, and 16. Then he kind of gets that second wind in his career that I feel like a lot of quarterbacks you'll notice get with their teams around 2017 to 2020. So I'll preface this too. So I've noticed this with a lot of these quarterbacks where like they'll have a window of success early in their career, usually when they're on their rookie deal. Then they kind of have this lull in the middle of their career, which I can't really explain why. I mean, money definitely plays a factor into it. You can't maintain the talent you have. Guys get older around them, but then they kind of figure it out by the time the quarterbacks are right at the end again. And the Saints figured it out in 2017, bringing draft guys like Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, Marshawn Lattimore. They're able to just really start competing seriously again. And this was around the time where, if he did win a second Super Bowl ring, I think that certainly would have helped his legacy. Like I said, he doesn't need to win a ton of, the rings aren't everything to me, but I definitely think it's more important that somebody can win at least one rather than winning multiple Super Bowls. Like, I feel like the first one's definitely the most valuable one, I guess is a good way to put it. Um, but the Saints end up coming up short 17, 18, 19, and 20. Um, and this was really where I started to notice, just watching these games, that Drew Brees was definitely starting to lose a bit of a step, which was a shame because the teams around him were finally good enough for the talent he was giving them all those years in the 2010s. But man, I know people say the refs cost them that 2018 NFC Championship game against the Rams after they beat, again, Eagles. But for me, it was when they got to overtime and Drew Brees throws just a lousy interception, just absolutely duck of a throw. Um, and there's 60 minutes in a game, and I mean in this case there was more than 60 minutes in the game, so I'm not going to hold that against him, but I think it maybe just holds him back a little bit when compared to some of these other players, because they come up short in 2018, then 2019 they get bounced in the wild card round by Kirk Cousins and the Vikings, and we've seen what this team's made of over the years too. Like, they're nothing serious. The Saints were better than them. They should have been able to beat them. Not saying that's, I guess 2019 is probably my greatest, like the best example of rings don't necessarily matter for a quarterback, but beating inferior teams does matter. You shouldn't be losing to inferior teams, especially at home. Like, the Saints should have beaten the Vikings in that game. Um, I mean, even when they lost on the road to the Vikings in 2017, like they definitely could have beaten them there too. Um, then 2020 was his final year in the NFL, and I mean, you knew going into that year that that was it for him. That was his last dance. By the time they get to the playoffs, I mean, this was the first year we had the 7 seed, so the Saints end up with the 2 seed, and they beat Mitch Trubisky and the Bears in the wild card round, super wild card weekend. But then we get to the divisional round. They're at home against Brady and the Bucks in the Superdome, and really just didn't have a very good game on his part. Let's see if I could pull up that the stat line for that game. But this was really when you knew it was over. You knew, all right, he's definitely not getting the second ring. I mean, he didn't have any of the individual accolades by that point. Um, But man, especially for a player of his size, though, like, he was a little guy. He was only 6 feet tall, just about. Geez, yeah, here it is. 134 yards, 1 touchdown, and 3 interceptions. I mean, you put that next to Brady with 199, 2 touchdowns, no picks. That's the difference there, right? Like, the 3 turnovers is what's going to cost you the game. It was only 30-20, so it was definitely within reach. But Drew Brees, love him, all-time great NFL player. He comes in at number 9. It's a shame because he's one of those guys you look at and it's like really just a great underdog story. But if things just went a little bit different for him in the playoffs, if the Saints had some better teams in the 2010s, after, like, between when they won that Super Bowl in 44 to around 2017, I'd say really that window of like 2016 to 2012 to 2016, if they had some better teams in there, like, we might be talking about Drew Brees a little bit differently. But I have him in at number 9, which I guess is very fitting because of his jersey number too. All right, so moving on to number 8. Number 8 We'll go old school on this. I mean, really far back. We'll go with Johnny Unitas, uh, of the then Baltimore Colts. They were in Baltimore up until the mid '80s when they moved to Indianapolis, and then the Cleveland. For any younger viewers who don't know, the Baltimore Colts moved to Indianapolis, and then a decade later, the Cleveland Browns moved to Baltimore to become the Ravens. And you might be thinking, well, how's that possible? The Cleveland Browns are still a team. So when the Browns moved, then the NFL added an expansion team, just as kind of like a forgiveness to Cleveland. They were able to keep the Browns name as well. Anyway, it's Johnny Unitas. This is a guy who, I mean, I know some people will probably have him a lot higher on their list too, and I definitely this 6 through 9 I feel like could have went many different directions. I mean, Drew Brees very easily could have been as high as number 6. Johnny Unitas very easily could have been as high as number 6. The next two guys very easily could have been 8 or 9. Um, but in this case, I would say the fact of the matter is, it's just talent's always evolving, and that's what's holding him back. But um, man, like what he was able to do in this era is just absolutely amazing. So he comes into the league in 1956, and I mean, for most of his career, this was pre-merger. This was the Baltimore Colts of the original NFL before they had merged with the AFL. And my God, you look at some of these stats here. 1960 throws for 3,000 yards, which, man, 3,000 yards in 1960. Like, I know 3,000 yards isn't really anything special today, but this was a completely different game back then. You're talking about they had like the goalposts on the goal line, the goal, like the field goal posts were like, now they're behind the end zone. Back then, like they were just sitting on the goal line. So if somebody was coming over the middle, forget about worrying about linebackers. You could just smack right into the goalpost, just running across the middle trying to catch a slant pass. So um, I mean, if you're trying to do a quarterback sneak too, like it was just another obstacle. It's like having another man out there on defense at the goal line. So the fact that he was able to perform as well as he did, and you look at like 1959, he throws for 32 touchdowns with just 14 interceptions. Like again, I mean, only 20, just a touch under 2,900 yards, but that's the kind of season that even today, like that's not bad. Like a starting quarterback could do that, and we'd be like, yeah, that's a good season. I mean, even last year for 2022, like passing numbers were relatively down. Um, 32 touchdowns would have been up there. Let me pull up the numbers last year real quick where that would have ranked. So 32 touchdowns would have been fourth in the league in 2022. The only guys who threw for 32 touchdowns last year were Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and Josh Allen, who I think are the consensus top three in the league right now, at least at this moment in time. So the fact that we're talking about the 1950s, not the 90s or the 80s when you had plenty of great quarterbacks and it was definitely starting to trend towards being more of a passing league like post West Coast offense. We're talking about the 50s when it was very much like, I mean, you still had guys playing two ways. You would have guys who would play center and then they'd go out there and play linebacker on the next series. Um, you had Johnny Unitas throwing for 32 touchdowns at 241 yards a game. Like, that's crazy. And then he ends up with 3 MVPs in his career. He ends up with 5 first-team All-Pros, 2 second-team All-Pros, and several more Pro Bowl selections. Um, and man, then let's look at the playoff stats here too. So I mean, it wasn't really anything amazing, but I mean the playoffs were also a little bit different back then too, of course, like pre-merger. But 7 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Again, this is the 50s and 60s though, like completely. It might as well be a different sport than what we're playing now. Um, 1663 for his passing yards, not bad at all. And I mean, a 6-2 record, he was pretty solid. And then, I mean, technically, he does have a Super Bowl win, Super Bowl V, um, believe against the Cowboys, and that was, if I remember correctly, that came down to a field goal right at the end. I know a lot of those early Super Bowls really weren't entertaining. They didn't really go down like nowadays in the post like Tom Brady era. It seems like every Super Bowl goes down to like the last 10 seconds, but it really wasn't the case back then. But Super Bowl five was one of those exceptions. It was definitely a nail biter. And Johnny U was able to come out on top at age 37 there. So he was able to get a Super Bowl under his belt. Believe he did win several NFL championships as well. Let me see if I could pull that up. But yeah, I mean, he's really, let's see. Yeah, three-time NFL champion, 1958, 1959, 1968. Put a slight asterisk next to 1968 because that was, of course, during the 4-year span where the NFL champion would play the AFL champion in the first four Super Bowls. They weren't technically one league, though, and they infamously lost to Joe Namath. We're going to win, guarantee it. And he did. Johnny U lost that game, although I believe he didn't even play that game. I want to say it was Earl Morrall. But Johnny Unitas, have to give him his roses. I'll put him in here at number 8. I know some people say, oh, well, that's too low. And other people will say, oh, well, talent's just gone so much further. Like, you look at a guy like, you put Patrick Mahomes next to him and what he's able to do on the field, or even some of the other quarterbacks in the league now, like Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, and say, oh, well, Johnny Unitas can't do what those guys can do. But believe me, like Johnny Unitas is playing a different game than these guys are now. Much less friendly on the quarterback than Patrick Mahomes has working with. A lot less passer friendly. And honestly, for when he played, I mean, his stats definitely start to taper off towards the end, but he plays an 18-year career, which for back then, that's pretty good. Like, I mean, we're talking about, Mr. Tom versus Time over here with uh, 23 seasons, but Johnny Unitas played 18 back then, and this was much more physical game. This is before we had, like, I mean, my God, just with like how far athletic training's coming. This was a half a century ago. How far athletic training has come in that time. Like, he wasn't on like a special diet or anything like Tom Brady was. He wasn't taking care of his body the same way. Guys are smoking cigarettes on the sideline back then, I'm sure. Like, I mean, you had Lenny Dawson smoking a cigarette at the halftime at Super Bowl one. Like, we know they were doing this. Like, these guys just weren't taking care of themselves like they were now. So the fact that he was able to perform as efficiently and effectively as he did, man, it's absolutely remarkable. So I'll put him in here at number 8. Um, yeah, definitely have to give credit to Johnny Unitas. We'll move on to number 7. So at number 7, I'm going to go with Steve Young. And I almost put him at number 8. I know that would have been fitting with the jersey number again, like with Drew Brees, but bump Steve Young up to number 7. So these next two are definitely a coin flip. Steve Young, I feel like he honestly gets underrated. And I know some people might not even have him in their top 10 list, but I feel like he is firmly in the top 10 list. Like, he's one of those guys, like I said, the top 9 I knew were solidified. I knew that there was no tapering from that. The only debate I really had was number 10 and then the order of some of these guys. I'd say 6 through 9 I had a lot of debate with, and then in the top 5 a little bit of debate, but I feel like the top 5 is going to be a little bit more solidified. Steve Young at number 7, though, his career trajectory is just very interesting because, of course, he starts out with not the 49ers. He starts out with the creamsicle Tampa Bay Bucks in the mid-'80s, where they were just a wretched team, just absolutely awful. And he didn't really play much his first year, only starts 5 games. 935 yards, 3 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. Like, oh, this is a top 10 quarterback? Like, really? It gets better. I'll just give it a little bit. The next year, he starts 14 games. I believe it was only a 14-game season at the time, so he started every game. The Bucks go 2-12. He has 2,200 yards, 8 passing touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. But one thing I will say with Steve Young that's going to really set him apart here, It's his rushing ability. Really is his rushing ability. Because he's probably the only guy in this top 10 that I would say really had a strong presence. Like he's a strong presence as a dual threat quarterback. And I think he's only the only left-handed quarterback on this list too. Um, but 1986 with the Bucks, he rushes for 425 yards and 5 touchdowns. So they combine that with 2,200 yards in the air. All right, you're looking at maybe around more like 2,700 yards total and 13 touchdowns scored to 13 interceptions. Again, this isn't anything impressive, but this was a horrible Tampa Bay team. He's a young guy, still at 25. He has plenty of time ahead of him here. So then he gets traded to San Francisco, which is absolutely fascinating because San Francisco is at their height around this point, or well, about to be at their height, I guess. They had already won 2 Super Bowls in the 80s with the duo of Bill Walsh, Joe Montana, and I mean, let's be real, just an absolutely loaded team on offense and defense. Um, so Steve Young gets traded to the 49ers, which was a very curious decision at the time because the 49ers already had Joe Montana in place, but he ends up sitting on the bench for, I mean, really the next 4 years. I mean, he gets worked in every now and then, and I feel like it was definitely a tactical move on Bill Walsh's part. He wanted to push Montana. He wanted to have some healthy competition for all of his positions. Why would quarterback be excluded? So you see a young, talented guy on a horrible team like Steve Young. It's like, yeah, why not bring him in? Especially if it's not going to cost us too much. And this was pre-salary cap, pre-free agency. So why not give a shot to a guy like Steve Young? He's still young, no pun intended. Give some healthy competition to Montana, and I mean it did. I mean, spoiler alert, we'll talk about Joe Montana later, but really propelled propelled Joe Montana to new heights. Propelled the 49ers as a team to new heights. As a result, they win the back-to-back Super Bowls in 88 and 89, and I would say those are probably their two most convincing Super Bowl wins. They win they win one in 81 and they win another one in 84. Not taking anything away from those, but those late 80s teams, that was when San Francisco really came into the road. And you had Jerry Rice in place by then in his prime. They were just firing on all cylinders. And Steve Young was a part of those teams, whether he was starting or not. Like, just his presence was helping them, and he did get into some games here. Let's not pretend like he was just riding the bench the whole season. 1989, he throws for 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions in 3 games started, 10 games played overall. So he was working his way onto the field. And then we look at his rushing stats during this time. 1987, 190 yards, 1 touchdown. 1988, 184 yards, 1 touchdown. 1989, 126 yards, 2 touchdowns. 1990, 159 yards, 0 touchdowns. But I mean, I guess he's kind of like, at the time, he kind of used them like they used him like Taysom Hill with the Saints and Drew Brees at the time. But I mean, obviously, Steve Young would become a Hall of Fame quarterback, whereas it doesn't look like Taysom Hill's gonna. But then let's see. So Montana ends up getting injured in the NFC Championship game against against the Giants in 1990 when they had, I believe it was Tim Hofstetter at quarterback for the injured Phil Simms. So you had the matchup of two backup quarterbacks there, Steve Young versus Tim Hofstetter. Giants end up winning. They win Super Bowl 25 that year against the Bills. Wide right. Cost Jim Kelly one of his Super Bowls. But Montana's still out the following year. And the 49ers just hand the keys to Steve Young. Say, all right, it's your team. Let's see it. So 1991's really where his season begins. And he ends up, 1999 ends up being his last season. So Steve Young is one of those quarterbacks where, like, he's synonymous with the decade. He's synonymous with the 1990s. I would say that was his entire prime. That was pretty much like all of his good years were in the 1990s. And I would say, in terms of 90s quarterbacks, he's definitely in the top two. I know some people might say Elway's up there, but I'd say Steve Young is hands down in the top two. We'll talk about number one in a little bit here, but um, so he gets the keys in 1990. He doesn't have a bad season. 2,500 yards, 17 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 11 games played, 10 games started. Um, Not bad. I'm sure it's not what Niners fans wanted to see after the reign of dominance in the 80s with Joe Montana, and that definitely becomes a trend for Steve Young, especially with the playoffs too. Like the Niners, he didn't even play in the playoffs for the Niners that year. I think this was an injury-shortened season for him too. He has a 5-5 record and 10 games started, but it kind of becomes just a thing for the 49ers here over these next few years where Steve Young just isn't the guy to get them over the hump. He's known as like not Joe Montana, which is crazy because I mean, we're talking about him as the seventh best quarterback of all time, and he wasn't even the best quarterback on his roster for so many years. He was playing with a guy who's still going to be coming up further on this list. So 1992, this is where he starts to really come into his own. Um, so 35, just shy of 3,500 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and then on the ground he has another 534 yards and 4 touchdowns. And the 49ers starts all 16 games. 49ers go 14-2. He wins the league MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, first team All-Pro. All right, Steve Young has made his presence felt. He has said, "This is my team, Joe Who." And Joe Montana was still on the roster for this season. But, I mean, he forced the 49ers' hand. They end up moving him to Kansas City after the season just because he played so well. He was the best player in the league that year, and he was 31 years of age, so he wasn't super old. I mean, he definitely wasn't a young buck anymore, but still definitely in his prime. Then we get to the playoffs here and starts 2 games, 540 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. And now this is where the Cowboys 49ers rivalry really takes off. 49ers and Cowboys play in the NFC Championship game that year. Cowboys win. Cowboys go on to smack the Bills in the Super Bowl. Jim Kelly's third straight Super Bowl loss, fortunately, but this is where it really starts to become like, all right, Steve, you're a great player. Now win us the Super Bowl. So 1993, it's like, all right, going into the season, you're our guy. Joe's gone. We need the ring, though. We need number 5 for the 49ers. Excuse me. So 1993, how's Steve Young respond? How does he come out? Well, maybe not quite as good as 1992. Still good, but not quite as good. He throws for 4,000 yards, which is actually 500, a little over 500 yards better than the year before. Throws for 29 touchdowns, again better, but 16 interceptions. Don't love to see that. 49ers finished 10-6. Don't love to see that when you're trying to go all in for the Super Bowl. On the ground, another 407 yards, 2 touchdowns. Again, not a bad season by any means. He ends up finishing second in the MVP this year, second in Offensive Player of the Year. Wins the All-Pro, first team All-Pro again. But then let's see the playoffs, though, because that's what the 49ers fans really wanted to see this year. So playoffs, again, they go to the NFC Championship game, again against Dallas. For the playoffs that year, he has 513 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Lose to Dallas again. Dallas goes on to beat the Bills again. So it's kind of just a repeat of last year. Definitely felt like the 49ers are kind of stuck in neutral here. Now Steve Young's got 32 going on 33. Like, all right, patience is starting to run out. We need results. We need you to get that monkey off your back, you know? So 1994. This was Steve Young's magnum opus. This was his career season. When most people think of Steve Young, this is the season they think of. He comes out with a purpose this season. which even though early on that season, I believe they did lose to Montana and the Chiefs, which I know really had the 49ers fans like, all right, like, Steve, what's going on, buddy? Like, you can't get us the Super Bowl, and now you're losing to Montana too. Like, we need results. They go out. They went and got Dion that year too to put them over the top. That this was supposed to be the year. This was supposed to be their year, plain and simple. But after a bit of a patchy start, they take over. They just absolutely take over. The whole team comes into their own, spearheaded by Steve Young. 35 touchdowns to just 10 interceptions through the air. 7.6 touchdown percentage, just 2.2 interception percentage. Runs away with the MVP, first team All-Pro yet again for the third straight year. On the ground, how's he doing on the ground? He gets another 293 yards and seven touchdowns combined with the 35 in the air. 42 touchdowns total for Steve Young in 1994. Absolutely dominant. And this is why you really look at him and it's like, yeah, he might have been the best dual threat quarterback of all time. I might even go make that statement right now. He was the best dual threat quarterback of all time, better than Michael Vick, better than Russell Wilson, better than whoever else you want to throw out there. Fran Tarkenton, if you want to go back. Steve Young was the man. And then we get to the playoffs in 1994, and he just keeps it going. Like I said, they caught fire early in the middle of the season there, like that around like week 5, week 6, and they just took off. They get to the playoffs that year. 3 games played, 9 touchdowns for a 10.3 touchdown percentage with 0 interceptions. You know what that means? That's the stat line of a Super Bowl winning quarterback, and that's exactly what he was that year. They just run through everybody, including the Chargers in the Super Bowl. Rest in peace to rest in peace to Junior Seau. But man, like they steamrolled the Chargers in that Super Bowl against a good defense. Like Junior Seau, Rodney Harrison were on that team. They had some great players there, but 49ers just embarrassed them in that Super Bowl. And then on the ground in that postseason, he has another. Let's see here. Another 128 yards and another 2 touchdowns on the ground. Yeah, so Steve Young got the monkey off his back. He was firmly cemented his legacy as an all-time great quarterback, not just for the 49ers, but for the NFL in general. Obviously, he didn't go on to win 4 rings like Montana, but like I said, winning a large quantity of rings, like the first ring is definitely the most valuable. And we'd be talking about Steve Young much differently if he didn't win that Super Bowl compared to now. The fact that he wasn't able to win like 2, 3, 4, 7, whatever we need to feel good about him. No, the one's good. The one's plenty. That was all he needed. That's something he could really hang his hat on and feel proud about. That whole team can, because that team was struggling to beat the Cowboys the previous 2 years, and they were able to get over the top in 1994. They were really able to cement their legacy across the board. That was awesome to see for a guy like Steve Young, because he definitely deserved that with what we're seeing so far. So 92, 93, 94, great season after great season after great season. Then he kind of tapers off after that. Definitely battles some injuries down the stretch here, 95 through 99, his last 5 seasons in the league here. I mean, he was getting up there in age by this point, too. He was 33 going on 34 in 1995, but doesn't play bad. Doesn't play bad. His touchdowns continue to dramatically outpace his interceptions. Continues to throw well in terms of yardage. 1998, he's able to stay healthy, and they're really able to have a good season all around. 49ers go, well, they're 11-4 with him as a starter, but he throws 36 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. By this point, he has Terrell Owens and Jerry Rice on his team. So, yeah, then they had that all-time classic in the wild card round against Green Bay where T.O. has the catch 2.0. Yeah, that's really it for Steve Young. He's an all-time great. I don't care what people say. He's definitely a top 10 quarterback of all time. I know he didn't really do much in his 20s. I know that kind of set him back. Like look at like Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady and the amount of success they've had in their 20s. It's like, yeah, that's what's setting Steve Young back. But I don't know. If things went differently in his 20s, in the 80s, he wouldn't have had the success that he did in the 30s and his 90s. Or, I'm sorry, in his 30s, the 1990s. Um, Everything happens for a reason. For Steve Young, starting out with Tampa, getting that exposure early on, then going on to back up Montana under Bill Walsh for a few years, and then coming into that roster. Everything happened for a reason. His career went exactly the way it was supposed to. He comes in at number 7. I don't really think that's controversial at all. Um, I mean, you could interchange him with Johnny Unitas or Drew Brees if you think, oh, well, Unitas' era was so much harder. Drew Brees was just so much more refined as a quarterback, just threw up so many better stats. I understand that, but for me, Steve Young, he had a great combination of all of it. He had great individual talent in terms of passing ability and rushing ability, which really sets him apart. Like I said, great statistical season still. It's not like he was just a product of playing on a great team like say Troy Aikman of the same era. Troy Aikman had 3 Super Bowl rings, but you don't see me mentioning him on this list. Because I'd say Troy was more of a game manager for those teams. He was a good player in his own right, and I'd say he was a good leader. He was able to keep those guys on the same page, but I don't think he had that as great of an individual ability as Steve Young. His statistics certainly weren't as good as Steve Young's. Um, and yeah, I mean, always have respect for Steve Young. Gladly put him at number 7 here. So moving along to number 6, we have another '90s quarterback here. Probably, I'd say it's a coin flip with him and Steve Young for who's the best quarterback of the '90s. Um, I mean, everybody knows who this is. It's Brett Favre. I mean, what do I need to say about Brett Favre that hasn't already been said? This guy is an absolute icon for the NFL. Transcended time, played exactly 20 seasons in the league. Green Bay Packers legend. Although he did come into the league with Atlanta. Um, he comes in with Green Bay. He gets traded to Green Bay in 1992 and was a backup originally, though he did get forced into action, I believe, in week 2. Um, Brett Favre gets thrown into the fire with Mike Holmgren there as coach, product of the Bill Walsh coaching tree in San Francisco. So this is where you start to see the West Coast offense really evolve. I mean, we've seen it evolve since then. It started with Bill Walsh in the 80s where we saw it become more of a passing league. Green Bay refined it in the 90s with Bill Walsh. And then I would say somebody like Andy Reid, who worked under Holmgren in Green Bay, has carried it on with Eagles and now the Chiefs. And we've seen plenty of coaches come out from under Andy Reid as well. But looking at Brett Favre here, um, this is somebody who had a absolute cannon of an arm. I mean, if we're talking about individual talent, this was a guy who had a rocket of an arm. Felt like he could make any throw on the field, and that was his greatest strength, but also his greatest weakness, right? Like, he could throw a ton of passing yards. He could throw a bazillion and one touchdowns. But my God, he'd make some poor decisions and make some terrible interceptions. So let's break it down here, right? So he comes in 1992, has 13 games started, 3,200 passing yards, 18 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. It's not a bad place to start. Really isn't. Green Bay goes 8-5 with him at the helm. And this is around, like during this time, so the next few seasons here, Green Bay goes 9-7 the following 2 seasons. He has kind of a similar stat line the next year. He throws 24 interceptions. You already see it right from the jump. 1993, 19 touchdowns, 24 interceptions. He's a Pro Bowl quarterback both of these years, but this is where this is a weird time for quarterbacks because a lot of the guys in the 80s, like Montana was injured during this time. I mean, Elway was around still, like Marino was around still, Jim Kelly was around still, Warren Moon, but there really wasn't anybody like stepping up to become like that next face of the league, and like we saw in the 2000, we would see in the 2000s to really take that mantle. And Brett Favre was definitely that guy. He like him and Steve Young, I would say, are definitely the two best quarterbacks of the 90s. Um, but really, when we want to talk about Brett Favre, we're really getting to the meat of it. It's 1995 where he really takes off, where the Packers as a team are able to take that next step, but he's also able to take that next step of him as a quarterback. And of course, he was dealing with pain killing addiction during this time as well. And I know, like in NFL films lore, he'll say around this MVP run, he cleaned his act up and he was able to get himself together when he really popped off here. And I'm sure he did make some improvements on that regard, but I also know he has come out since he retired and say, yeah, I kind of just said that to my coaches and teammates so they get off my back. So very fascinating to look into the psychology of that too, because just knowing the kind of player he was, Brett Favre was, you call him the gunslinger, but like he was a team first guy. He wanted to win. He was all about just trying to get touchdowns. He wanted points on the board, and he knew he had the ability. He wanted to put it into practice. He didn't want to leave with injury. He knew the team was better with him on the field, and he wanted to do whatever it took to win games. So, and again, that was his greatest strength and also his greatest weakness. But this stretch from 1995 to 1997, I mean, we're looking at 1995, 38 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, 4,400 yards passing. Easily wins him the MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, First Team All Pro, and he would win that each of the next. He would win MVP and First Team All Pro each of the next 3 seasons, 95, 96, and 97. And the Packers were becoming a much better team during this time too. They were able to upset San Francisco in 1995, beat Steve Young, and go on to play Dallas in the NFC Championship. Although they would lose, Dallas would go on to win their third Super Bowl in 4 years. But that's all right though, because their time was coming. They were a team on the rise, and in 1996, it was their time. They ended up getting over the hump. They beat the expansion Panthers in the conference championship their second year, and then in the Super Bowl, they end up beating Drew Bledsoe and the Patriots, coached by Bill Parcells, with, I believe, Bill Belichick on that staff as well. Um, Very impressive season for Brett Favre, 1996. That's, again, like Steve Young in 94, like John Elway in 97, this and Drew Brees in 2009. This is the season you think of with Brett Favre. This was when it all came together for him. Um, Man, and there's such a likable team too. Reggie White on the defense, Desmond Howard returning kicks, Mike Holmgren on the sideline, him running around in the Superdome with his helmet off, like just a really feel-good team, in my opinion. But they come back the next year. He has just as great of a season. A little bit of a step back statistically, but a baby step back. Again, wins his third straight MVP, First Team All Pro, and the Packers go 13-3 yet again. They get back to the Super Bowl, though they do lose that game to John Elway. Classic Super Bowl 32, a real heavyweight matchup between the Broncos and Packers there. Still stand by that that's an underrated Super Bowl. Um, but this is where I talk about that mid-career lull, though, right? So they come back the next year in 1998. They lose that game to Steve Young and the Niners in the wild card round, the Catch 2.0. And this is where you really start to see like a lot of these guys' legacies like overlapping. And you'll definitely see more of that as we go along with this. But um, after that season, Mike Holmgren leaves and Brett Favre really takes a step back after that. I'd say from 1999 to 2006, like this entire span here is just not great for him. It's just mediocre season after mediocre season statistically. Like the interceptions were always a problem, but they only got worse. The touchdowns were taking a step back. The yards were taking a step back. The Packers as a team were taking a step back, although they were still a good team. So let's see here. He really isn't up for any individual accolades during this time. He comes in third place for the MVP in 2001, second in 2002. Although, like, my God, he's he throws 15 plus interceptions in all these seasons, every last one of them. And then you get to 2005. This has to be one of the worst ones. Packers go 4-12. He has 20 touchdowns and 29 interceptions. 29 interceptions. That's almost two a game. I believe Mike Sherman was their coach at the time. Just a rough go about it for Brett Favre, man. This was when he had Aaron Rodgers as a rookie on the sideline too. Um, yeah, don't love to see that, man. Like, because you want to see the guy win. Like, he was a very rootable player on the field. I know he's gotten in some hot water since he's retired, but as a player, like anybody who grew up watching ball, you love Brett Favre. You want to see the best for him, and then this is the mid-career lull though, because then his career, he gets that second wind in 2007. The team starts getting better. He gets better again. 4,100 yards, 28 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. Packers go 13-3, and they lose a heartbreaker, absolute heartbreaker in the NFC Championship to the Giants, Eli Manning. So let's pull up his playoff stats here, because this is probably the most fascinating thing for me with Brett Favre. Obviously, early on in the 90s, 95, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 805 yards. 96, 617 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception. 97, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception, just over 600 yards, much like 1996. Like, this isn't bad. This is not bad by any means. This is actually quite good. But then you'll see, especially after Mike Holmgren leaves, like, it gets ugly. 2001 is definitely the worst one. That divisional round game against the Rams, the greatest show on turf. I think he threw 6 interceptions in that game alone. So for the playoffs that year, he finishes 550 yards in 2 games, 4 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. Like, you're not winning ball games. Certainly not winning playoff games with that stat line. And they weren't. I'm not going to say he was the reason they were losing these games, because he was also like one of the reasons they were there to begin with, but a lot of times he just got in his own way when it came to football in January. It was very unfortunate to see. And 2003, only throws 1 interception, but second round against Eagles. Or I'm sorry, yeah, second round against the Eagles, 4th and 26 game in overtime. Just throws a duck up there for like no Packers in the area, 3 Eagles there. Brian Dawkins just takes it like a kick return, takes us into field goal range to win the game. But then, I mean, here's the two. These are the two that really stand out. 2007 and 2009, which we'll get to his whole fiasco leaving Green Bay. But 2007, 2 games played in the playoffs, 5 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. They beat Mike Holmgren and the Seahawks in the divisional round, and then conference championship game, Eli comes in, frozen tundra in Green Bay. This is supposed to be like, man, we could have had such a good Super Bowl that year too. I mean, we did get a great Super Bowl with the Giants and Patriots, but imagine we had Brett Favre versus Tom Brady, Brett Favre on the Packers versus Tom Brady. That would have been really cool to see. But Brett Favre do what Brett Favre does. Get to overtime, throws an interception. Another one just like kind of just drops back, like off his back foot, throws it to the right, just throws it up in the air. I forget who it was for the Giants. But just an easy pick. They were already basically in field goal range after they caught that. You knew that was the game. You knew it was over for him in Green Bay when that happened. He retires shortly thereafter, but I mean, we all know he comes back with the Jets the next year. Starts off great, but they end up falling apart. Throws 22 touchdowns and 22 picks. They go 9-7 and miss the playoffs. But funny enough, even with all these great seasons he's had with the Packers, I think his best season might have been 2009 with the Vikings. I really do. And not even because like, oh, well, he was able to do it outside of Green Bay. This was the one year he was really able to get his interceptions in check. Like, really get them in check. This was the only season he had where he threw less than 10 interceptions. He threw 33 touchdowns, 7 interceptions with 4,200 passing yards. Goes fourth place in the MVP voting. Vikings go 12-4, get the first round bye, steamroll Dallas in the divisional round. I think it was like 45-3 or something, just insane like that. And then NFC Championship game rolls around, and Sean Payton puts a bounty on his head, or I'm sorry, Greg Williams puts a bounty on his head. And Sean Payton definitely didn't help matters. But be what it be, Brett Favre, man, and you could see, like, it was hard to watch. Like, even as a 10-year-old at the time watching that game, you knew that just watching this guy, like, he wanted to get back out on the field. You could see he was 40 years old at the time, and he's like crawling and like aching, like just reaching up, just trying to get back in. And oh, it felt so bad for him. Like, you really wanted to see him win that game because you knew, like, this was it for him, and he knew this was it for him. And he, like, for him, like, coming to the Vikings, like, just the fact that he was able to beat the Packers and stick it to them in the regular season was enough for him. Like, getting to a Super Bowl again, especially if he was able to win that Super Bowl, like, that was just gravy for him. But if he could have done that, like, that really would have been remarkable and really would have been a cool way for him to go out on top. But even despite him getting his body broken in that game, he had them in a position to win. Tie game 28-28, I believe, with regular in the last 2 minutes of regulation. He has them driving, and Brett Favre do what Brett Favre does, throws an interception across his body to Tracy Porter, who would be the Super Bowl hero too, and they end up losing in overtime. And he comes back the next year begrudgingly after a lot of convincing from his teammates, and he was a dead man walking that year. 2,500 yards, 11 touchdowns, 19 interceptions. This is a shame. He went out with a whimper, but I'll put him in at number 6 here. Another thing with him too is just the longevity. Like, he just had such great longevity for his career. 20 seasons played, and like we said again, like with a lot of these other quarterbacks who played in a more pass-friendly league since then, Tom Brady aside, even you look at like Drew Brees played 20 seasons, but Drew Brees came in the league 10 years later. When Brett Favre was at his last year, like in 2009, 2010, that was just when Drew Brees was starting to come into his peak. So, man, the fact that Brett Favre played 20 years from 91 to 2010 really saw the game evolve a lot of ways during his career. It was a much different game over those 20 years. And, I mean, it's hard not to like this guy just as a player. Amazing stats in terms of just the raw numbers, in terms of the yards, the touchdowns. Obviously, the interceptions are a problem, but his arm was his greatest asset, but also his greatest weakness. What else can you really say? If he had a little bit more refined decision making, I think he'd be a lot higher on this list. I think there is another quarterback that is a lot like him that'll be later on this list in terms of that. And just in terms of the skill set with the arm, but he's also much more efficient. I think we're seeing that with Patrick Mahomes too, honestly. He has that rocket of an arm, but he's much more careful with the football. And that's, I think, what's going to make him just more of an evolution of Brett Favre. If Mahomes ends up playing in the league for 15, 20 years, this is his floor. This is where he starts at. Like, I feel like you can't have him any lower than this number 6 spot. All right, so that'll do it for the bottom 5. Geez, this is already pushing an hour and 20 minutes, so I might even break this up into 2 separate videos. So stay tuned for numbers 5 through 1. Think you guys can probably figure out who 5 through 1 are at this point, but stay tuned for the order.